about on my podcast. So someone asked me a question. The other day, someone actually asked me a question. Like, what is one bitter fact about podcasting in Kenya? About, starting a podcast in Kenya. Rule number one, or rather, let's call this list. Let's call this list 10 bitter truth about launching a podcast in Kenya. 10 bitter truth. Truth number one about launching a podcast in Kenya. Just quickly. And please stay tuned for another episode. Now, for the next episode after this, I'm going to basically take you through launching now the podcast in Kenya. Now, for this one is just basically 10 bitter truth facts that you really need to know before launching a podcast in Kenya, or about launching a podcast in Kenya or Africa, right? So, truth number one, you'll always be your own audience. Like, when you're starting the podcast, it's very lonely. It's a lonely place. It's a very lonely place in a way that, podcast, especially if you're just doing only audio, like before you even get to 10 listeners, 20 listeners, 30 listeners, fact is you're going to be the only one always listening to your podcast. Right? So how do you move from being the only one listening to your podcast? So now that's where it involves making sure you have right digital strategy, have the right branding, make sure you know how to build up your own audience, like all these small things, which I will talk about them on the next I think on another video, probably next week. Number two, so probably like one, especially if you don't have numbers, getting your first hand, let's just say if you first hand listeners, it's not gonna be easy. It's not easy. So be prepared. It's gonna take you, for others, it's gonna take you almost a month for you to have 100 listeners. So that's why it's important for you to have a very strong digital footprint for your own personal brand, so that when you're starting these things, it's easy for you to it's easy for people now to like get into to start watching your content. So it's not easy. So number two, so number one is it's not easy building up your audience and building up, having that one first 100 listeners. Number two, quickly, your audios will suck. If you're doing your podcast in audios or both audios and videos, your first episodes will always suck. Even if you have dope camera, if you have like really nice, I don't know, like the first episodes will always suck. Like the first episodes, and it's utakuwa na kismat if episodes za kwanza zinaanza kupata viewership, you get like maze hapo uko na kismat. If your first episode starts getting listenership, hapo uko na kismat. Oh, by the way, as we're celebrating our anniversary, we are proud of 60,000 views and 100,000 listeners. So thank you all. Thank you. That's close to around 300,000 audience. Almost 500,000. Anyway, is it 300,000? Yeah, almost 500,000. Yeah. So number two is your first episodes will suck. And the fact is, even if you have like the best whatever, the first few episodes will suck. Like 80% of people who get into podcasting, first few episodes always suck. So get over it. If you're creating a podcast and you don't like the episode, you don't like your first episode, upload it. Be proud of that episode, because it's your episode. Because at least you've started, at least you've taken that step. You've started your podcast, all right? That's number two. Number three. Number three is 90% of people you write to when it comes to collaborating on your podcast, whether they are advertisers or collaborating with a certain organization or company, 90% of the responses you'll get is 1, let me look into it. 3, talk to us after like 5 months. 4 is we will get back to you. We will get, yeah. And the reason why they'll say they'll get back to you is 80% of those responses is because they don't understand how to package, how to basically market their products and brands in podcasts. So it's not, don't take no offensively when you approach someone to collaborate with, advertiser and all that kind of stuff. Don't take it personal, please. Don't take it personal. It's just because podcast is a pretty new thing in Africa and Kenya, so for them to be responsive positively to collaborating, to putting the advertisement on your podcast, they need to understand. And so it's gonna be lucky if you're pretty good in terms of doing your pitch, in terms of pitching your podcast to potential advertisers and collaborators. Like utakuwa yani uko na bahati ukipitch, then all of a sudden you start getting advertisers. Now with that point, I want to say thanks so much to our advertisers who have been advertising on the podcast. That is Absa Kenya and what else? Absa, Mizuna, Made in Kenya store Alchemist. So thank you so much for all the people who have been advertising on the podcast. Anyway, point number 4. Is it number 4, number 5? Another thing about starting a podcast in Kenya is please, you will always be your own marketer. Like, don't expect, even your friends, don't expect your friends to share your podcast. Even your family. Like, if they're gonna share, well and good, but don't expect anything from anyone. Like, don't expect anything from someone when you're starting a podcast. When you're trying, let me repeat that point. It's 20 minutes, so I'm gonna leave it there. The other points, I will finalize the other points on another special episode that is coming up on how to launch a podcast in Kenya or Africa, right? So this one is just basically few tips. So other tips will come next week, I promise. Next week I will upload few more tips because I just want this video to be only 20 to 30 minutes. Anyway, the last one is, which is very important, is when you're starting your podcast or before launching your podcast, one bitter fact that you need to know is that don't expect anything from someone. Don't. Because people will disappoint you. Whether videographer, whether your graphic designer, whether someone who's doing marketing, don't expect anything from someone. If people are going to share your podcast, well and good. Of course, tell them to share. Of course, you have to. But if they're gonna share, well and good. If they don't share, don't take it personal, because you don't owe anyone anything. You don't owe anyone anything. That's the bitter fact about content creation. So don't expect anything from anyone. Make sure you start with what you have. And the good thing about podcasting, which I will leave my point, I'll stop my point here, is you can start with only your phone. You can start your podcast with only your phone and a mobile application. That's the good thing about podcasting. Like, you don't need a fancy camera. You don't need, unless you're doing both audio and videos, which is what I do. I do a podcast both in videos and audios. So please don't, last point, which is very important and which I've come to learn. Your friends will say, oh, I love your podcast. Oh, it's a nice thing. Don't even take that seriously, because it may not be genuine. Not everyone is happy for you that you've started your podcast. All right? Like, Maze, just don't take anything to your heart. and don't take things personal. If people don't share your podcast, or people don't listen to your podcast, if your friends don't share your podcast, if your family don't share your podcast, come on, don't be worried about that, because it's just how we are. For us human, we are wired like that. We want to support people once they start making it. When they don't make it, we don't support them. So don't expect anything from someone. Start with your phone. Next week, remember, next week I am uploading a special episode on how, like a very 30 minutes episode on how to launch your podcast in Kenya and Africa. And also please take note that we are offering services when it comes to podcast setup or content creator. So if you're trying to launch your podcast in Africa or in Kenya, please reach out to us. We're offering those services, from branding to conceptualization to marketing to recording. Don't worry, even if you're far away from Kenya, we still can offer the services. We have our own ways on how we do those things. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure you stay tuned for a special episode next week on how to launch your podcast in Kenya. Next week I'm bringing you a really, really amazing full episode on how to launch your podcast in Kenya and in Africa. Meanwhile, bitter fact number 1 is that you will always be your own audience. All right, so don't expect that you start your podcast and you hit 100 listeners in a couple of few months or few weeks. Number 2 is make sure you understand your audience. Make sure you understand your content. Like, not everyone. I don't even don't know if that was the point. But again, I think it's important for you to, before you launch your podcast, it's important for you to like get to understand your. I'm rushing because it's almost 30 minutes and I wanted this episode to be only 30 minutes. So make sure, like, one bitter fact is that you're not guaranteed of an audience. Before you get 100 listeners, it's not going to be easy. I think the last one that I can't really remember all the points. I was just like from my head. The last important one was like, you don't owe, no, the world doesn't owe you anything. So don't expect anything from anyone. Build your podcast assuming like you're the only audience. You're everything. You're paying yourself. You're like, just assume you're everything, so that when, just in case someone disappoints you, you don't take it to your heart. Anyway, I see it's 25 minutes. Yeah. So yeah, Maze, one thing I've learned about launching a podcast in Kenya, like, it's a new thing. It's a new industry, which I will tackle much about it next week, with data, with analytics, with everything. I'll back up the data. And oh, by the way, we what do I say? When you're trying, one thing that I've learned when you're trying to start your podcast in Kenya is that most times people will say they like your podcast after they see it's doing well. Once it starts doing well, that's when everyone is like, I love your podcast, I like your podcast, I love your podcast, I like your podcast. So yeah, that's what's up, Maze. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for subscribing. This was just a random or a special episode based on what we have learned, what I've so far learned from launching a podcast in Kenya, which I will do fully.